Hopefully we are live. Hello everyone, welcome to another live session. I am Rakesh De from the team Voyages into the Past or Atit Probaho. As you know that we organize lectures with interdisciplinary approach, today's lecture is very special for us since we are very fortunate to have with us Swami Medhananda. Swami Medhananda is a monk of the Ramakrishna order and associate professor and head of the program in philosophy at Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda Educational and Research Institute in Belur Math, West Bengal. His current research focuses on Vedāntic philosophical traditions, cross-cultural philosophy of religion, cross-cultural approaches to consciousness, Indian scriptural hermeneutics, and the philosophies of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo. She is a section editor of the International Journal of Hindu Studies, Springer, overseeing submissions in Hindu and cross-cultural philosophy of religion. He has presently completed a book, a manuscript, Swami Vivekananda's Vedāntic Cosmopolitanism, which highlights Vivekananda's cosmopolitan engagement with Indian and Western thinkers and explores the contemporary relevance of his philosophical positions. He has also written Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Swami Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion, and the Dialectics of Aesthetic Agency, Reevaluating German Aesthetics from Kant to Adams. He is the editor of the book, the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Vedanta. He is also the editor of two special issues of the International Journal of Hindu Studies, one on Vedāntic theodicies that is forthcoming, and other on Swami Vivekananda as a philosopher and theologian that is in progress. His articles have appeared in various journals like Philosophy, East and West, Journal of Religion, Journal of Indian Philosophy, Journal of Dharma Studies, etc. He has also given various lectures on various philosophical thoughts in various seminars, conferences, workshops, etc., both nationally and internationally. We are really very much honored to have such an eminent person for our lecture series. Thank you, sir, from my entire team for accepting our invitation and giving your valuable time. Swami Medhananda today will speak that is free will an illusion? The philosophical perspective of Sri Ramakrishna. Now I wish to hand over the microphone to Swami Medhananda so that he can continue with his lecture. Thank you once again, sir. Over to you.
Thank you, Rakesh, for the generous introduction. And thank you also to Sanvit for inviting me to join you today. Thank you for attending this lecture. And I look forward to the question and answer session afterward. Let me first share my screen. Okay, so can you see me? Can you see the presentation? I can't hear. So can you see this presentation? Anyone?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarva dharmaswarupine avatar varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. Okay, so I thought I would discuss a very interesting philosophical topic today. Is free will an illusion? And discuss Sri Ramakrishna's perspective on this issue, which is not often discussed. Let's begin. So, I hope I don't have to tell you who Sri Ramakrishna was. He was a great Hindu mystic of the 19th century, and many consider him to be an incarnation of God, an avatara. And he's most famous, arguably, for having taught the harmony of religions. As he said, Jotamot Totapat, or Mat Pat, as many faiths, so many paths. But his teachings, as recorded in the Kautamrita, this recording of his teachings in Bangla by one of his householder disciples, Mohandranath Gupta, his teachings are actually quite wide-ranging, and they cover a wide range of philosophical topics. And as Rakesh mentioned in his introduction, I published a book in 2018 called Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, where I discuss in depth some of these philosophical teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. So if you're interested, you can look at that book. But today I just want to focus on his views on free will and determinism. So if we want to summarize his views on free will and determinism, I think this is a very helpful passage. So it's from page 376 of the one-volume Udbodan edition of the Bangla Kathamrita. And so that's the K here. And the G refers to the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, which is Swami Nityananda's English translation. So that's the page number. Okay, so I'll read the English translation first. It is God alone who does everything. You may say that in that case, man may commit sin, but that is not true. If a man is firmly convinced that God alone is the doer and that he himself is nothing, then he will never make a false step. It is God alone who has planted in man's mind what the Englishmen call free will, shadinicha. People who have not realized God would become engaged in more and more sinful behavior or actions if God had not planted in them the notion of free will. Sin would have increased if God had not made the sinner feel that he alone was responsible for his sin. Those who have realized God are aware that free will is a false appearance. In reality, I am the machine and God is the operator. I am the carriage and God is the driver. And because this is a very important passage, I'll just read the Bangla quickly, the original Bangla. So Sri Ramakrishna says, Tini shob korchen. Judi bolo তাহলে লোকে পাপ করতে পারে তা নয় যার ঠিক বোধ হয়েছে ঈশ্বর কর্তা আমি অকর্তা তার আর বেতালে পা পড়ে না ইংলিশমানরা যাকে স্বাধীন ইচ্ছা বলে সেই স্বাধীন ইচ্ছা বোধ তিনি দিয়ে রাখেন যারা তাকে লাভ করে নাই তাদের ভিতর ওই স্বাধীন ইচ্ছা বোধ না দিলে পাপের বৃদ্ধি হতো নিজের দোষে পাপ করছি এ বোধ যদি তিনি না দিতেন তাহলে পাপের আরো বৃদ্ধি হতো যারা তাকে লাভ করেছে তারা জানে দেখতেই স্বাধীন ইচ্ছা বস্তুত তিনি যন্ত্রী আমি যন্ত্র তিনি ইঞ্জিনিয়ার আমি গাড়ি Okay, so that's the original Bangla. So now, what is his view? The view is referred to technically as theological determinism by contemporary philosophers. That's the view that we have no free will at all, that God alone is the doer. So determinism means that we don't have free will. And theological, the term theological refers to God. So theological determinism in particular means that God is the cause of everything that we do. We do not have free will. God causes everything that we do, determines everything that we do. The way that Sri Ramakrishna puts it here is, it is God alone who does everything. Tini shob korchen. And he also adds that we learn the truth of theological determinism, that God is the doer, through the direct mystical experience of God. So he was a mystic, of course, and so he's not teaching these ideas on the basis of some intellectual reasoning or on the basis of intellectual hypotheses, but on the basis of his own direct spiritual experiences. There's more. I'm going to spend essentially the whole lecture unpacking this passage and other passages like this. So we're not through with this passage. We'll be revisiting it at different points. But let's begin slowly and carefully. So the following dialogue, this is also in the Kathamrita, between Sri Ramakrishna and the homeopathic doctor Mohanlalal Sarkar indicates that Sri Ramakrishna denied the reality of free will altogether. So this is another passage from the Kathamrita which supports the view that Sri Ramakrishna was a pretty thoroughgoing theological determinist. So Dr. Sarkar says, I do not say that the will is absolutely free. Suppose a cow is tied with a rope. She is free within the length of that rope, but when she feels the pull of the rope, and then Sri Ramakrishna interrupts him. Judu Mullik also gave that illustration. Is it mentioned in some English book? Look here. If a man truly believes that God alone does everything, that he is the operator and man the machine, then such a man is a Jivan Mukta. Thou workest thine own work, men only call it theirs. This is a quotation that Sri Ramakrishna gives from a song. Okay, so notice that the doctor's view, Dr. Sarkar's view is that it's not that we're completely free to do anything we want, but he also doesn't accept the view that our actions are completely determined. He has a kind of intermediate position. The idea is that we're partly free. We're free to a certain extent. And he used the analogy of a cow tied to a rope. So the cow can roam about within the radius of the rope, but it can't go beyond the radius, right? And Sri Ramakrishna says he had never heard of this analogy before, which is very interesting. And he says, well, where did you hear that analogy? Is it from an English textbook? So you get the sense here that Sri Ramakrishna aligns the doctrine of free will with a kind of Western worldview. And that his own view as a Hindu mystic is that we have absolutely no free will, and that God alone is the doer. Okay, so Sri Ramakrishna's view, ultimate position is that we don't even have limited free will. We have absolutely no free will at all. That's how I understand his position. Okay, so how does Sri Ramakrishna justify his theological determinism? He justifies it in two ways. One, by appealing to his direct mystical experience of God as the doer. And second, by arguing that our desires, which we did not ultimately choose, impel us to act. So let's first look at the first reason. So for Sri Ramakrishna, hard theological determinism, the term hard here is used, I use it in a technical sense, which means that it's a determinism that's incompatible with free will. But I don't want to go into that here because this is not a technical lecture. But in any case, so for Sri Ramakrishna, theological determinism is not a mere intellectual hypothesis arrived at through reasoning, but a spiritual conviction rooted in his own mystical experience of God as a doer. So this is a quotation from Katamrita. There is someone within me who does all these things through me. I am the machine and God is the operator. I act as she makes me act. I speak as she makes me speak. That's a quotation. Now, and he also knows, okay, ignore the last part of it. That was a kind of a messed up cut and paste. So let's move on. Okay, so now the thing is, anybody can appeal to their so-called mystical experiences and say that I directly experienced X or I directly experienced Y. But why should other people believe that you actually had those experiences, right? So there's always this kind of possibility of skepticism. Sri Ramakrishna knew that, and so he also gave a different, more kind of rational reason for believing in theological determinism, and that's what I try to explain in this slide. So on one occasion, which is recorded in the Katamrita, Sri Ramakrishna is in a discussion with the renowned playwright Girish Chandra Ghosh, and Girish Chandra Ghosh is debating about free will with the same Dr. Sharkar, that homeopathic doctor. So Sri Ramakrishna is listening to this debate about free will between Dr. Sharkar, who believes in limited free will, and Girish Chandra Ghosh, who adopts Sri Ramakrishna's perspective of theological determinism. And in response to Sri Ramakrishna's assertion during this debate that everything is determined by God's will, Dr. Sharkar claims as follows: but God has given us free will. I can think of God or not as I like. And then Girish Ghosh, taking Sri Ramakrishna's side, refutes Dr. Sharkar's claim by appealing to the law of psychophysical causation. Quote, you think of God or do some good work because you like to. Really, it is not you who do these things, but your liking of them that makes you do so. Now, just after that, in the midst of this debate, Sri Ramakrishna intervenes and he kind of further develops Girish Chandra Ghosh's deterministic argument for why our desires cause us to act and that the desires are not within our own control. So this is Sri Ramakrishna's quotation. He says, in order to do anything, one must have a belief about something and feel joy at the thought of what he believes. Only then does he set about performing the work. Suppose a jar of gold coins is hidden underground. First of all, a man must have the knowledge or belief that the jar of gold coins is there. He also feels joy at the thought of the jar. Then he begins to dig. As he removes the earth, he hears a metallic sound. That increases his joy. Next, he sees a corner of the jar. That gives him more joy. Thus, his joy is ever on the increase. Okay, so what does this passage mean, and how does it support theological determinism? So let's look at that. So according to Sri Ramakrishna, belief and desire are the motivating forces for all of our actions. We engage in a particular action only when we believe that there is something desirable to be gained from acting in that way. And one thing that's not directly mentioned in this passage, the one here, but which I think is implied, is that our desires were not ultimately chosen by us. So therefore, even though we often think that we act freely, our actions are in fact completely determined by desires that we did not freely choose to have. So as a theological determinist, Sri Ramakrishna maintains that God is the ultimate causal source of all of our beliefs and desires. So this is just a kind of very simple diagram. But so if you trace back any given action, you can trace it back to some combination of a belief and a desire. But that belief and that desire can be traced back along a kind of a very long chain that ultimately terminates in God. And that chain may involve multiple lives, right? Because Sri Ramakrishna believed in reincarnation, and so it may not just be in this life, but in previous lives too, we were nurturing the same beliefs and desires. But that ultimately, if you go back far enough, the ultimate causal source of all of our actions is God. Okay, so that's his kind of more rational justification of theological determinism. And remember, the mystical justification is that he himself has directly realized that God alone is the doer. So these are the two arguments he gives in favor of theological determinism. So now let's start thinking about some objections. So he was, most people don't give Sri Ramakrishna enough credit as a philosopher, but I think he was a really serious philosopher and a deep thinker. And so he would often anticipate objections that people might raise to his philosophical ideas. So this is one of these objections that he anticipates. The objection would go as follows: a person who feels that God does everything could engage in sinful actions and justify them by saying that it is God who makes that person sin. So Sri Ramakrishna raises and responds to this objection in the following passage. Quote, "It is God alone who does everything. You may say that in that case people may commit sin, but that is not true. If one truly realizes God alone is the doer and I am the non-doer, then he will never make a false step." So what is Sri Ramakrishna saying here? How does he respond to this objection? What he says is, only people who have realized God internalize fully the truth of theological determinism. Right, so it's only by realizing God and only after becoming a Jivan Mukta, somebody who's liberated while living, only by becoming a Jivan Mukta can you really know that God alone is the doer. And these Jivan Muktas, by definition, are not capable of committing sin, since they are conscious instruments of God. So just to flesh that out a bit more, let me try to explain briefly why Sri Ramakrishna thinks that Jivan Muktas cannot sin. He frequently aligns the feeling of doership, so being karta, with egoism, ahankara. As when he says, quote, "One must altogether renounce egoism, ahankara. One cannot see God as long as one feels, I am the doer." And he also often teaches that the wicked ego, the bodjat ami, makes one worldly and attached to lust and greed. So this is one of his most famous expressions, kamini kanchan, lust and greed. So for Sri Ramakrishna then, the feeling of doership stems from egoism, ahankara, which is itself the seat of such undesirable qualities as lust, anger, and greed. And it is precisely these qualities that frequently lead people to commit sin. So the Jivan Mukta, who has realized that God is a doer, cannot commit sin because he has eradicated egoism and all of the evil qualities rooted in ego that lead to sinful actions. Therefore, although the Jivan Mukta knows that he has no free will or moral responsibility for his actions, as Sri Ramakrishna says, that Jivan Mukta will never make a false step. Pa betale porbena. That's the original Bangla. Okay, now, that's not the entirety of his position on free will. It gets even more interesting. So let me explain the other dimension of his philosophy of free will and determinism. And the way I'm going to explain this other dimension is through another objection. Okay, so one might argue, however, that Sri Ramakrishna's response to this objection is inadequate as it stands. After all, even if enlightened Jivan Muktas are incapable of committing sin, unenlightened, ordinary people like us, like you and me, I'm not enlightened yet, and I assume most of you are not. Unenlightened, ordinary people can still engage in sinful actions and readily excuse themselves by claiming that God causes them to sin. So any one of us, we can say, well, Sri Ramakrishna says that God alone is a doer. That means we're not responsible for any bad, sinful actions we do, and we can do whatever we want. So it's a kind of, we can have a moral free-for-all or immoral free-for-all. and justify it in the name of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. So that's, okay, so now how would Sri Ramakrishna respond? Sri Ramakrishna responds to this objection by holding that even though there is no free will, God has implanted in unenlightened people the illusion of free will in order to prevent sin from increasing. So this is a very, very important aspect. This is that other dimension that I was talking about. So let's just, going back to the first passage that I quoted, I'm going to just read out to you again the relevant part of that passage. So he says, "It is God alone who has planted in man's mind what the Englishmen call free will. People who have not realized God would become engaged in more and more sinful actions if God had not planted in them the notion of free will. Sin would have increased if God had not made the sinner feel that he alone was responsible for his sin." So this, in my opinion, is the most original aspect of Sri Ramakrishna's position on free will and determinism. You don't see this. I mean, if you study philosophy and you study this issue of free will and determinism, you'll come across many, many different theories of free will, theories of determinism, theories of theological determinism, but you'll very rarely come across the idea or the combination of theological determinism with this idea that God has implanted in us the illusion of free will. So that's a very strikingly original position, I think. So according to Sri Ramakrishna, God himself, in his infinite wisdom, planted in ordinary unenlightened people the illusion of free will. We mistakenly think we're free, so long as we have not realized God. Why did God plant this illusion of free will in us? Otherwise, we would have engaged in more and more sinful actions. So let's try to unpack that a bit more. He explains in many other places also that if people actually believed that God is a doer, if everybody, including unenlightened ordinary people, believed this, if they all believed in theological determinism, it would have morally disastrous consequences. Why? The reason is, he says that the sense of free will is a necessary condition for the feeling of moral responsibility. So we only feel morally responsible for our actions because we feel that we're free to do a certain action or to refrain from doing a certain action, right? So therefore, if ordinary people did not feel that they were free, they would not have taken moral responsibility for their actions, which would have resulted in a massive increase in immoral behavior. This is the basic logic. I think it's pretty intuitive. I mean, I think most people will think this is pretty commonsensical. In another passage, Sri Ramakrishna further spells out the harmful social consequences of not believing in free will. He says, as long as a man has not realized God, he thinks he is free. Totokhon mone hoy amra shadhin. It is God himself who keeps this error in man. Otherwise, sin would have multiplied. Ei bhram tini rekhe den, ta na hole papet vritti hoto. Man would not have been afraid of sin. There would have been no punishment for it. So the word for punishment is shasti. So according to Sri Ramakrishna, God keeps the error, the mistake of free will in unenlightened people in order to prevent sin from multiplying. And indeed, without the sense of free will, the very social institutions of justice and punishment would collapse, since these institutions presuppose moral responsibility, which in turn depends on free will. So, if somebody steals something and he's taken to court, the whole idea of being taken to court and then punished for stealing something is that you assume that that person had the freedom not to steal, right? But if there's no free will, then just imagine what would happen with the institutions of justice, of law, of punishment. So for Sri Ramakrishna, the feeling that we are free, even if in reality we are not free, is a sufficient basis for feeling morally responsible for our actions. Okay, so this is a very subtle point. The feeling that we're free, that is, even though we're not free, just the feeling that we are free is enough to make us feel morally responsible for our actions, even though we are ultimately not morally responsible for our actions. So it's a very subtle position. So try to think about that. Now, we can raise another objection to his theological determinism. One might object that there is a contradiction in Sri Ramakrishna's views on free will. What is the contradiction? On the one hand, he maintains that theological determinism is true, so no one has free will. Since God's the sole doer, people do not have any control over their actions. That's pretty clear. On the other hand, he claims that God has implanted in unenlightened people the illusion of free will in order to prevent sin from increasing. Now, this is where the problem comes in, the second dimension. This claim, the second claim, seems to presuppose that people do have control over their actions, since an individual's feeling of moral responsibility can only curtail immoral action if that person actually has control over her actions, his or her actions. In other words, so this is it seems to be a commonsensical position. If no one has free will, how could the presence or absence of the feeling of moral responsibility affect one's actions at all? So I think this is a very deep objection. It's a serious one. But Sri Ramakrishna, again, kind of anticipates this objection. And I think from Sri Ramakrishna's perspective, he would rebut this objection as follows. What he would say is that theological determinism is perfectly compatible with the view that the presence or absence of the feeling of moral responsibility affects one's actions. Although God is the sole doer, I think what Sri Ramakrishna would say is that God achieves his purposes through the device of the illusion of free will and the consequent feeling of moral responsibility. So if we think of our feeling of moral responsibility as an instrument, like the Bangla here that Sri Ramakrishna would often use is jontro, right? If we think of our feeling of moral responsibility and our feeling of free will as an instrument or device through which God himself acts in the world, then there is no need to assume that an individual has to have control over her actions in order for the presence or absence of her feeling of moral responsibility to affect her actions. This is a fairly subtle point, so I'm going to try to explain that in the next slide as well, with an example. So let's use an analogy with a billiard ball, okay? Or in the US, it's called pool, and in the UK and I think in India, they call it billiards. So a person playing billiards can make the ball behave in various ways, depending on how she strikes the ball with her cue being that stick that you use to hit the ball. If I am watching her play and I say the ball curved right, or the ball would have gone into the corner pocket if it had been struck differently, I am obviously not ascribing agency to the ball. Rather, I mean that the player caused the ball to act in different ways by manipulating the cue. Similarly, Sri Ramakrishna holds that God causes us to act through our feeling of free will and moral responsibility. Okay? So right, in the case of pool or billiards, right? We see somebody hit a ball with a stick and the ball goes in different directions. We might not talk about the pool player. We might say the ball went in this direction, the ball went in that direction. But in fact, what we mean is that the person who struck the ball struck it in such a way that it went in a certain direction. In the same way, we can say that it's through the instrument of the feeling, the illusion of free will and the illusion of moral responsibility that God determines everything that we do and causes us to commit less sin than we otherwise would have. That's the basic idea. And so, to sum up his response to this objection, when Sri Ramakrishna makes the counterfactual claim that ordinary people would have committed more sin if God had not implanted in them this feeling of free will, I take him to mean that God would have caused ordinary people to act more sinfully through their knowledge that they are not free. So just to explain this with a diagram. So the actual scenario, according to Sri Ramakrishna, the world in which we live now, in which we have the illusion of free will, is as follows. God causes us to have this illusory feeling of free will, which leads us to feel morally responsible for our actions, and that leads us to commit fewer sinful actions. This is the world in which we live in, according to Sri Ramakrishna. The counterfactual scenario, that is what might have been if we did not have knowledge of free will. If we did not feel that we were free, is as follows. So this is the counterfactual scenario. God causes us or gives us the knowledge that we have no free will, that God alone is the doer. So just imagine everybody in the world knew that I'm not responsible for anything I do. I have no free will. God alone is doing everything through me. What would happen is that we would end up human beings would end up committing many more sinful actions. This is Sri Ramakrishna's main point. But notice that if you trace back that causal chain far enough, you end up with God in both the scenarios. That's the key to understanding how Sri Ramakrishna would respond to this objection, this apparent contradiction. Okay? Now, there's yet another philosophical problem, which I would call the problem of colliding standpoints, which Sri Ramakrishna also addresses. So let's first look at what the problem is, and then we can look at how Sri Ramakrishna responds to this problem. So Sri Ramakrishna's view clearly depends on a key distinction between the standpoint of the unenlightened person, the Ajnani, and the standpoint of the enlightened Jivan Mukta, the one who's liberated while living, the one who has realized God. So Ajnani and Jivan Mukta. Now, the Jivan Mukta knows that God alone is the doer, and that he has therefore neither free will nor moral responsibility. However, since the Jivan Mukta acts as a conscious instrument of God, he is incapable of doing anything immoral. Remember, this is what we talked about earlier in the presentation. Sri Ramakrishna says the one who has realized God, he can never take a false step. By contrast, the Ajnani, the unenlightened person, has the illusion of free will, which makes him feel morally responsible for his actions. So these two standpoints, when kept apart, seem to be perfectly coherent. But what happens when these two standpoints collide? For instance, what if a Jivan Mukta, an enlightened being who has realized God, were to tell an Ajnani that free will is actually an illusion and that God alone determines everything that we do? Could this lead the Ajnani, the unenlightened person, to abandon his belief in free will? And if it did, wouldn't the Ajnani's premature belief in theological determinism have morally and socially disastrous consequences? So what if a God-realized soul like Sri Ramakrishna were to tell ordinary people, you don't have free will? And what if we believed him? And what if we acted according to that belief? Then wouldn't that be disastrous from a moral standpoint? That's the problem. In fact, as we've already seen, Sri Ramakrishna frequently taught the truth of theological determinism, that God alone is the doer, to his visitors, people who came to visit him on a daily basis, many of whom were presumably not enlightened, right? Most of them hadn't realized God. That's why he's giving them advice. That's why they're suffering. That's why they're coming to him in the first place, because they haven't realized God. So, for instance, on one occasion, Sri Ramakrishna explains to his visitor that God alone does everything. And then an interesting dialogue ensues. So this is a dialogue between a follower of the Brahma Samaj, a very popular movement in the 19th century in Kolkata, and Sri Ramakrishna. So this is what the Brahma follower says. If it is God that makes me do everything, then I am not responsible for my sins. Sri Ramakrishna says with a smile, yes, Duryodhana also said that. O Krishna, I do what thou, seated in my heart, makest me do. If a man has the firm conviction, the Bangla is Tik Bishash, that God alone is the doer and he is his instrument, then he cannot do anything sinful. He who has learned to dance correctly never makes a false step. One cannot even believe in the existence of God until one's heart becomes pure. So this is a very interesting and pregnant passage. Let's try to unpack that a bit. So the follower of the Brahma Samaj points out a seemingly disturbing consequence of theological determinism. If we don't have free will, then we would not be morally responsible for our sins. It's a very commonsensical position. But Sri Ramakrishna remains unruffled, and he responds that only one who has realized God can have the firm conviction, Tik Bishash, that God alone is the doer, and such a person cannot do anything sinful. So from Sri Ramakrishna's perspective, the Brahma's worry is unfounded because it is impossible for an unenlightened person truly to believe that God is the doer. Indeed, Sri Ramakrishna makes the startling claim that even belief in God's existence requires purity of heart and mind. Why do I call this a startling claim? It's startling because most people think that, I can either choose to believe in God's existence or choose to be an atheist. That it's a matter of choice. But Sri Ramakrishna says it's not as easy as that. It's impossible to believe in God so long as your heart and mind are impure. What is his reasoning for this position? It seems to be as follows. So long as our mind is impure, our thoughts and feelings will revolve around sense pleasures, bishoybor, rather than God, thereby preventing us from believing that God exists. So according to Sri Ramakrishna, the psychological requirements for believing in theological determinism the view that God alone is the doer, are even more stringent than those for believing in God's existence. So there's one belief that God exists. There's an even more difficult to earn belief, which is the belief that God not only exists, but God alone does everything, right? So genuine belief that God alone does everything requires nothing less than the direct experience of God. This is Sri Ramakrishna's fundamental claim. You cannot genuinely believe that God alone does everything until you have realized God. On one occasion, Sri Ramakrishna's disciples asked him, "Sir, is it not then in human hands to practice spiritual disciplines, sadhanas? A person might simply say, whatever I do is according to God's will." Sri Ramakrishna then responded as follows: "What good does it do to say that? One may say there is no thorn, no pricking, but one still cries out when one's hand is pricked by a thorn." So from Sri Ramakrishna's perspective, so long as I've not realized God, even if I profess to believe, even if I claim to believe that God alone is the doer, I cannot help but feel that I am the doer. This brings us to another interesting position in contemporary epistemology. The position is called Doxastic Volunteerism. Okay, so it's a fancy term, but the idea is quite simple. The view of Doxastic volunteerism means doing something voluntarily. Doxastic is an adjective referring to belief, right? So Doxastic volunteerism is the view that we can voluntarily adopt beliefs. I can just choose to believe in, that God exists. I can choose to believe that it's raining outside, like that. That's the view of Doxastic volunteerism. Now, Sri Ramakrishna's striking claims that only a Jivan Mukta can believe that God is the doer, and that only one with a pure heart can believe in God's existence, indicate that he would have rejected what contemporary epistemologists call Doxastic volunteerism, the view that we can adopt beliefs at will, at least with respect to beliefs about God's existence and theological determinism. Indeed, some recent philosophers have provided arguments against Doxastic volunteerism that can be marshaled in support of Sri Ramakrishna's position. So for instance, there's a very famous epistemologist who passed away a few years ago. His name is William Alston. In 1988, he wrote an important article about this issue where he made a convincing case that it is not within our power simply to choose to believe that God exists in the face of the lack of any significant inclination to suppose it to be true. As Alston points out, what might seem to be a case of forming a belief in P, so P stands for any propositional belief, that God exists, that it's raining outside, etc. What might seem to be a case of forming a belief in P is often something quite different. So this is a direct quotation from his 1988 article. S, the subject S, a human being, may be seeking for whatever reason to bring himself into a position of believing P. And S or others may confuse this activity, which can be undertaken voluntarily, with believing or judging the proposition to be true. So put in plain English, he's making a distinction between somebody trying to believe in something and somebody who actually believes something. And he's saying that we often confuse these two things. For Sri Ramakrishna, merely professing the belief that God exists, just saying, I believe that God exists, or I believe that God is the doer. We often hear that, right? That profession of belief should not be confused with actually believing that God exists or that God is the doer. Alston's argument, so William Alston's argument against Doxastic volunteerism, provides a helpful way of fleshing out and defending Sri Ramakrishna's distinction between actual belief and the mere profession of belief. We can think of an unenlightened person's profession of belief that God is the doer as an attempt to bring herself into a position to believe that God is the doer. So ordinary people who have not realized God, who say, I believe that God exists, I believe that God does everything. Tini jontri ami jontro. In fact, what they're doing, if you're very careful about it, I think what you'll see is that they don't actually believe that God is a doer. They're trying to believe that God is a doer. And by repeating that statement, that's a kind of sadhana for them, where that kind of reinforces in their mind that God is a doer. And eventually they may actually believe that God is a doer. However, according to Sri Ramakrishna, we can truly believe that God is the doer only after purifying our minds through intense ethical and spiritual practice, through sadhana, and by attaining ultimately the direct mystical realization of God as the doer through God's grace. And finally, I wanted to add one more complication to his views on free will. It has one more dimension. It's this Vigyana dimension. And I'll explain it briefly, just because I think it is important. So Sri Ramakrishna's stance on free will and determinism is significantly complicated by his oft-repeated teaching that Ishvara Kotis, Ishwar Koti, which he defines as a spiritual elite consisting in incarnations of God and those born as a part of one of these incarnations. So the Bangla there is Avatar ba Avatarer Ongsho. These Ishvara Kotis are able to attain the panentheistic mystical experience of Vigyana, which is even greater than the Jivan Mukta's realization of God as the doer. According to Sri Ramakrishna, the Vigyani realizes that, quote, it is Brahman that has become the universe and its living beings. God has become everything in this universe. It is clear that Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Vigyana were based on his own mystical experience. As he puts it, the Divine Mother has kept me in the state of a bhakta, a Vigyani. So he says it explicitly, he was a Vigyani who saw that God alone has become everything in this world. From the Vigyani standpoint, God himself sports in the form of unenlightened and enlightened people, as well as everything else in the universe. What is the relevance of that to his views on free will? Well, that's what this slide talks about. Theological determinism is compatible with, and in some of its forms, even presupposes the view that God is different from his creatures. So the idea is quite simple. Theological determinism is the view that God alone is a doer. Okay, and we are his creatures. So if we don't have free will, but God does have free will, and God is causing us to do all the different things that we do, there seems to be a difference between us, we the creatures of God, and God himself, right? The Vigyani, however, sees that there is nothing but God, and consequently that even his creatures are nothing but different guises of God himself. So every one of us, me, myself, as Swami Medhananda, you in the audience, every single one of the audience members here who are listening to the lecture today, everyone in the world, are just different masks that God himself puts on in a spirit of sportive play. This is the Vigyani standpoint. Therefore, while the Jivan Mukta realizes the truth of theological determinism, that God alone is a doer, the Vigyani exceeds even this Jivan Mukta's realization by partaking of God's own absolute freedom, since the Vigyani knows that she herself is God in a particular form. So this again is a somewhat subtle point. The idea is that, so just think about these two different kinds of spiritual experience. So on the one hand, the Jivan Mukta has the spiritual experience that God alone is the doer. But the Jivan Mukta may still feel that he or she is different from God. So it's, he is the instrument and God is making him do all the things that he's doing as his instrument. But the Vigyani realized that there's nothing in this world but God. So it's a kind of radically Advaitic position, that there's nothing in the world but God. And that means that every single one of God's instruments are themselves different manifestations of God. So that if God alone is free, we are also God. And as God, we are also free, right? So as God, we are free. As mind-body complexes, we are not free. That would be the kind of Vigyana dimension to Sri Ramakrishna's position on free will. So to kind of clarify the three different standpoints that Sri Ramakrishna is talking about here, I just want to sum it up here. In order to understand Sri Ramakrishna's complex views on free will and determinism, we have to distinguish the standpoints, these three standpoints, the standpoints of the Ajnani, the unenlightened person, the Jivan Mukta, the one who is liberated while living, and the Vigyani, the one who has the realization that God has become everything. While the Ajnani mistakenly believes that she is free and morally responsible for her actions, the Jivan Mukta realizes that God alone is the doer and that she is merely God's instrument. The Vigyani, however, realizes that she and everyone else are different forms of God himself. Since the Vigyani knows that she is not different from God, God's freedom becomes her own. So if we just are able to carefully distinguish between these three standpoints, I think that we'll have an easier time wrapping our heads around Sri Ramakrishna's views on free will and determinism. And in this last slide, I just want to summarize briefly his views on free will and determinism. Okay, first, Sri Ramakrishna unambiguously denied the existence of free will and affirmed theological determinism, the view that God determines everything that we do and think. At the same time, however, he repeatedly urged people to renounce sense pleasures and to engage in spiritual practice. Now, how do you kind of reconcile these two dimensions? He adopted a strikingly original strategy for reconciling hard theological determinism with self-effort. In Bengal, you would say purushokar. He claims that God, in his infinite wisdom, has endowed ordinary unenlightened people with the illusion of free will for the sake of their moral and spiritual welfare. An individual's illusion of free will leads her to feel morally responsible for her actions, and this feeling of moral responsibility in turn reduces the likelihood of her engaging in sinful actions. As a mystic, Sri Ramakrishna also maintained that all of us will eventually overcome this illusion of free will, either in this life or in a future life, when we have the salvific mystical experience of God as the doer. So this whole presentation was based on an article that was published about 2 years ago in the Journal of World Philosophies. And if you're interested in further details, and if you're interested in what I do in this article, which I didn't discuss at all here in this presentation, is I actually compare Sri Ramakrishna's views on free will with 3 different Western philosophers: the Scottish philosopher Lord Keynes, and 2 contemporary analytic philosophers, Saul Smolansky and Dirk Pereboom. So if you're interested, you can find that article. You can download it from my academic website, academia.edu. Thanks a lot, and I look forward to your questions. I can't hear you, Rakesh. Rakesh, you've got to unmute. Yeah.
Yes. Sorry. Thank you for, sir, your excellent speech. We are very much enriched for this amazing lecture, and hope same for our viewers. So we can move to our question answer session. The question is from Himadri. What were his views on Vedanta?
Yeah, this is a good question. If you're interested in this question, I'd recommend that you look at chapter 1 of my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, because I discussed that exact question. The short answer to the question is, yes, I think he did believe in Vedanta. He would often talk about different Vedāntic scriptures, especially Bhagavad Gita, but also other texts like Bhagavata Purana and Adhyatma Ramayana. And his views are very much in line with the Vedāntic scriptures. But what kind of Vedāntic philosophy did he teach? That's a very complicated question. Different scholars have different views on this issue. Some claim he followed Shankara's Advaita, others claim he was a Tantrika. And the author of Kotamrita, Mohandranath Gupta, he claimed that Sri Ramakrishna was a Vishishtadvaitan, so he followed Ramanuja's philosophy. So I intervene in this debate in this first chapter of my book, so I'd recommend that you look at it. But I claim that he followed, or that he taught Vigyana Vedanta. I coined that term. And I call it that because I think that he taught his Vedāntic philosophy on the spiritual basis of Vigyana, which I just talked about at the end of my presentation today. And how does that differ from Shankara's Advaita? There are 3 basic differences, just to say very briefly. Number 1, Shankara believes that the ultimate reality is only Nirguna Brahman, so the impersonal non-dual Brahman. By contrast, Sri Ramakrishna claims Brahma or Shakti Abhed, which means that Brahman, Nirguna Brahman, is inseparable from Shakti, which is the personal dynamic aspect of the same infinite divine reality. So Sri Ramakrishna, unlike Shankara, accepts the ultimate reality of Shakti. That's the first difference. Second difference, he claims that, Shankara claims that, the famous formula to sum up Shankara's view is Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. The world is ultimately unreal, non-existent. According to Sri Ramakrishna, however, the world is a real manifestation of God. He says this in many places. And thirdly, it has to do with spiritual practice, sadhanas. So according to Shankara, there's only one direct and independent path to liberation, and that is, for any of you who study Shankara, you should be able to tell me very quickly, it's Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. That's the only path that leads directly to liberation. According to Sri Ramakrishna, however, many different yogas lead equally to salvation. Jnana Yoga is one of them, but he equally claims that Bhakti Yoga can lead directly to salvation. He also claims that Karma Yoga can lead to salvation. He claims that any mixture of Jnana and Bhakti or Raja Yoga can also lead to salvation. So that's another fundamental difference. Thank you for the question. If you want more details, just please look at the first chapter of the book.
Thank you, sir. We move to second question from Shombit Roy Chaudhary. Does free will only exist for Vigyani, or a Gyani or Ajnani only lives in an illusion or free will? And what are his views on Sankhya school?
Okay, so these are two completely unrelated questions. Okay, well can you keep the question, or it just disappeared? Anyway, okay. Is there any way to keep the question on the screen? Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, so okay, so it's not about, so does free will only exist? I think the question is not perfectly framed, I would say, the first question. So let's put it this way. Sri Ramakrishna's view is that we as individual creatures do not have free will at all. Whether we're a Gyani or not Gyani is not relevant. The Gyani who knows that God is a doer, he also doesn't have free will. So the Ajnani doesn't have free will, but thinks he or she has free will, right? That's that illusion of free will that I was talking about in the presentation. The Gyani knows that he has no free will because he knows that God alone is the doer. And the Vigyani is a special kind of case, right? It's this very rare soul, an Ishvara Koti, who goes beyond the realization of the Gyani and who realizes that he is in one sense not free and in another sense free. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. Maybe that's a better way than I put it in the presentation. So in one sense, the Vigyani knows that he is not free because he has the Gyani's realization that God alone is the doer. So he's still inhabiting a body and a mind, and he knows that I'm not controlling this body mind. God within me, the Antaryami, he's doing it, he or she, the Divine Mother is doing everything through this body and through this mind. That's how the Vigyani knows that she is not free. But on the other hand, the Vigyani also knows that he is free, that she is free. How? Because the Vigyani realizes that there's nothing but God, and that every single one of us is nothing but a different form of God. So as God, we are free. But as body minds or as individual souls, we are not free. That's I think maybe the best way to answer the first question. And the second question, what are his views on the Sankhya school of Indian philosophy? As far as I'm aware, he never explicitly talks about Sankhya. I think he was aware of it, and there are some phrases he uses that signals that he used concepts from Sankhya. For instance, he would often say that the Vigyani dekhe Brahmoi Choturbinshi Tattva hoyechen. Choturbinshati Tattva, the 24 cosmic principles, comes directly from Sankhya philosophy. So I would say he doesn't have views on the Sankhya school in that way, but he clearly accepted certain fundamental teachings of Sankhya, like Prakriti. But unlike Sankhya says that Prakriti is the cause of everything in this world. They don't believe in Ishvara, right? But Sri Ramakrishna would obviously say that Ishvara, Ishwar, is the one who so Ishwar Sisti Sisi Paloy Koren. That's something that Sri Ramakrishna would say again and again. It is God who is responsible for the creation, the preservation, and the dissolution of this universe. That's a view that would not be accepted by the Sankhya school. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is from Aditya Shankar Chattopadhyay. What is the impact on Swami Vivekananda of the teachings of his guru regarding free will theory of Sri Ramakrishna?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that's an excellent topic for an article. If you're interested, you can explore that further. But in short, Swami Vivekananda, he once said, free will is a misnomer, right? So the way he basically argues is that the will as such is something that occurs within the mind. And the mind itself, according to Indian philosophy, is insentient. It's jada. In Sanskrit, the term is jada. So the will cannot possibly be free if it's just an insentient thing, like, if it's just an insentient piece of matter, if it's part of that matter. So he thinks that free will as a concept is a contradiction in terms. God alone is free, but then you wouldn't say that God has free will. It's not a will anymore, because the will is something that belongs to the mind, and the mind, from an Indian standpoint, is insentient. So I think Swami Vivekananda pretty strictly follows Sri Ramakrishna's views on free will and determinism. But I'll add one thing, which is that, remember that in my presentation, there's this other dimension of Sri Ramakrishna's view, which is that even though we are not free, God has implanted in us the illusion of free will. And when I read the complete works of Swami Vivekananda, I don't find that dimension of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on free will to be very explicitly expressed. That's what I would say. That doesn't mean that he didn't accept that. I just don't see that explicitly articulated in the complete works. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. This is the next question. It is from G. Krishnan. Namaskaran Swamiji. What do you think is the role of choice in human life? Then has not God given the opportunity of choice to all human beings, right from birth to death?
Yeah, so I think Sri Ramakrishna's view is, no. We only think that we have choice, but in fact we don't have choice. But don't worry, so long as you have not realized God, you necessarily believe that you do have a choice. And that's enough for you to engage in moral behavior. And so that's the basic idea, is that his position is a pretty radical one. And it might be disturbing to some people, but I think that's what his position is.
Thank you, sir. The next question from our beloved professor, Moin Akbar. Can we say that the experiments of Benjamin Libet or C.A. soon somehow support Ramakrishna's insight?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, now there's a whole kind of burgeoning field in philosophy. It's called like neurophilosophy. And one of the major philosophers in this area is Neil Levy. He's written several books on this issue. And I think he's one of the major philosophers arguing from the standpoint of neuroscience that we don't have any free will. There are different philosophers who really believe that we have absolutely no free will. They argue for that position in different ways. So there's another philosopher named Dirk Pereboom. He argues for it, but from a different standpoint. But in any case, Neil, the questioner is asking about what's Libet's experiment, which has to do with neuroscience and the brain, and how the brain works. And so I think it's a good question. I think it is very relevant. So experiments like Libet's is an old experiment, but there are more recent ones that are also being done. So if you look at, I would recommend that you look at Neil Levy's books, N-E-I-L, and the last name is L-E-V-Y. And he discusses these issues in the kind of latest neuroscientific research on these issues in great detail. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. This is the last question from Arvind Yadav. What is the difference between Atman or Upanishad and not self of Buddha?
Okay, so this question, as far as I'm aware, it doesn't have too much to do with the topic of free will, but I can answer it briefly. And it's also a huge question. I mean, there's a huge debate about, is there a difference between the Upanishadic concept of the Atman and the Buddhist concept of anatta, right? In Pali, it's anatta or anatma. In Sanskrit, the non-self doctrine. And there are some scholars like Miri al-Bahari, Perry Schmidt-Leugel, and a number of others who argue that, in fact, the difference is only apparent, and that the Buddha's doctrine of no self did not actually teach that we have no self, but that he's denying the permanent reality of this body-mind complex. But he didn't deny the existence of a deeper non-dual Atman. So that's one view, but then that's actually the minority position among scholars. But the majority of scholars of Buddhism will usually argue that there is a difference, and that Buddhists generally hold that there really is no self at all. It comes close to something like David Hume's doctrine. And some people have done research on this, comparing David Hume's doctrine of no self with Buddhist doctrines. And by contrast, they would claim that the Upanishads teach that each one of us is ultimately this spiritual, eternal Atman. And that seems to be different from the Buddhist no-self doctrine. So a short answer to your question is that it's controversial. And I don't want to say yes or no, because I think it's a very complicated issue and it requires a lot of research. And I want you to think for yourself about, but you can read the scholarship on the issue. If you're interested in looking at some references, you can look at the end of chapter 3 of my book, Infinite Paths, where I discuss this issue. Thanks.
I think that's all. Okay, so we have appeared at the end of our session. Thank you, Swamiji, once again for this amazing session. And also thank you to our viewers for whom we get inspiration to organize such lectures. The most important announcement is that our next lecture is on 31st January by Shruti Kapila on Gadar, violence, and the political potential of the planet. Please check the comment section and also our Facebook page for the further details. And also keep your eyes at our Facebook page, Instagram page, YouTube channel, WhatsApp group, and Telegram channel for further updates. Thank you once again for supporting us, and thank you also, Maharaj. Please stay safe, stay happy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.